It was an unseasonably warm October evening in a small town in Georgia, the kind of town where every face was familiar and every action carried whispers of judgment. The late sun painted the red brick buildings in hues of orange and gold, but the air was heavy, tinged with an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to the streets like the humidity. At the center of it all was a dimly lit diner on Main Street, its neon open sign flickering faintly as if unsure whether it should remain on. Inside, the chatter was subdued, the clinking of forks against plates punctuated by occasional murmurs. At a corner booth, Marcus Reed sat alone, stirring his coffee absently. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm intensity in his eyes, Marcus exuded a quiet strength that demanded attention. Yet the other patrons avoided looking directly at him, their sideways glances and hushed conversations betraying a mix of curiosity and unease. He wasn't a stranger to this. Being a black man in uniform had always drawn reactions, but this town carried an extra edge, a kind of skepticism that dug beneath the skin. Marcus wasn't dressed to make a statement that evening. He wore a simple black hoodie and jeans, a deliberate effort to blend in. His Navy SEAL tattoos were hidden under his sleeves, his rank and medals left behind in a locked box miles away. He had come to this town for peace, a brief respite from the relentless grind of deployments and missions. Yet even here, the weight of being watched, judged, and preemptively misunderstood followed him like a shadow. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a polite smile, approached his table cautiously. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly as if uncertain how he might respond. "No, thank you," Marcus replied, his tone measured and kind. "Just the check when you get a chance." She nodded quickly, scribbling on her notepad before retreating to the counter, where two men sat nursing beers. They leaned in close as she passed, their whispers barely audible, but Marcus caught fragments. "Doesn't belong here. Wonder what he's hiding." Marcus let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He had learned, long ago, not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of confirming their worst assumptions. But inside, a simmering frustration churned. He wasn't angry for himself. He'd endured worse during his time in the military. He was angry for every young black man who didn't have his training, his discipline, his ability to stand tall in the face of such venom. As he reached for his wallet, the bell above the diner door jingled sharply, and a pair of uniformed police officers walked in. The room seemed to shrink as their boots echoed against the tiled floor. One of them, a stocky man with a hard-set jaw and cold blue eyes, scanned the diner before locking his gaze on Marcus. "There he is," the officer muttered to his partner, loud enough for everyone to hear. The air shifted, conversations halted, and all eyes turned toward Marcus. He froze mid-motion, his hand hovering over the table as he assessed the situation. He didn't know these men, but their intent was written all over their faces. The officer approached with deliberate steps, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. His partner trailed behind, his expression a mix of uncertainty and obligation. "Evening," the first officer said, his voice dripping with authority. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Marcus met his gaze steadily, his heartbeat steady but his mind calculating every possible move. "Just having a cup of coffee," he replied evenly, gesturing to the mug in front of him. "Funny," the officer said, his lips curling into a smirk. "We got a call about someone matching your description, said you were acting suspicious." Marcus felt the familiar sting of injustice, but he kept his composure. "I've been sitting here for over an hour. You're welcome to ask the waitress," he said, his voice calm but firm. The officer chuckled darkly. "We don't need to ask anyone. I think you and I both know why you're here." Behind him, the patrons of the diner sat in silence, their discomfort palpable but their unwillingness to intervene even louder. Marcus scanned the room, noting the lowered eyes and averted gazes. He was alone in this, as always. The second officer shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just—" "Quiet," the first officer snapped, silencing his partner. "I've got this." He leaned in closer, his hand still on his holster. "How about you stand up nice and slow and we take this outside? We can have a little chat." Marcus didn't move immediately. Instead, he stared into the officer's eyes, his own filled with a quiet defiance that refused to be broken. He could feel the weight of every injustice he'd ever faced pressing down on him, but he also knew that this wasn't the time or place to let it explode. As he finally pushed himself up from the booth, his movements deliberate and controlled, the room seemed to hold its breath. He stood tall, towering over the officer, his presence commanding and unshakable. "Let's go," the officer said, motioning toward the door. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. But as he stepped past the officer, he leaned in just enough to let his voice carry in a low, measured tone. "You're making a mistake." The officer stiffened, his hand tightening on his holster. "Is that a threat?" Marcus turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto the officer's. "No," he said simply. "It's a fact." The tension in the room was suffocating as Marcus walked toward the door, the officers following closely behind. The whispers resumed the moment they stepped outside, the patrons leaning toward each other in morbid curiosity. But just as the diner door swung shut, a low growl of thunder rumbled in the distance, a prelude to a storm that no one saw coming. Outside, under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, Marcus stopped and turned to face the officers. His expression remained calm, but his voice carried an edge that sliced through the night. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" The first officer smirked, his confidence unwavering. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You're just another punk who thinks he's above the law." Marcus shook his head slowly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that forced them to lean in. "I'm the guy who spent 10 years doing things you can't even imagine to protect men like you." For the first time, the officer's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But before he could respond, Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out a battered ID. He held it up, the embossed words, "United States Navy SEAL," catching the light. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air like the storm clouds overhead. "Now," Marcus said, his tone steady but laced with steel, "you want to tell me why you're really here?" And just like that, the world seemed to hold its breath, the night pregnant with the promise of consequences yet to unfold. The streetlight buzzed faintly as Marcus held out his Navy SEAL ID, his steady hand betraying none of the emotions simmering beneath his composed exterior. The lead officer, whose badge read Hansen, stared at the ID with narrowed eyes. The uncertainty from moments ago now bloomed into something uglier, a mix of wounded pride and suspicion. His partner, a younger officer named Carter, leaned in for a better look, his brows furrowing. "SEAL, huh?" Hansen finally said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Doesn't mean you're above suspicion." Marcus didn't flinch. He'd heard it all before, the subtle diminishment of his accomplishments, the disbelief that a black man could hold a title like his. It never got easier, but he had learned how to navigate these moments. With his back straight and his voice calm, he replied, "I'm not looking for special treatment, officer. I'm looking for fairness. Now, if you've got something to charge me with, go ahead. Otherwise, I'd like to finish my coffee in peace." Hansen scoffed, clearly irritated by Marcus's refusal to show fear. But before he could escalate the situation, Carter cleared his throat. "He's legit," Carter murmured, nodding toward the ID. "We should let him go." For a moment, Hansen's face darkened, as though he was wrestling with the idea of backing down. Then, with a sharp motion, he turned away. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't think for a second that you're untouchable. I'll be watching you." As the two officers walked back to their squad car, Marcus let out a slow breath. His heart was steady, but his mind raced. He'd dealt with men like Hansen before, men who saw authority as a tool for control, not protection. He knew this wouldn't be the last he'd see of the officer. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was no less tense. As Marcus stepped back in, the patrons who had been watching quickly turned their attention to their food or phones, pretending they hadn't been hanging on every word outside. The waitress returned to his table with the check, her hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry about that, she said softly, her eyes darting toward the door. Marcus gave her a small, reassuring smile. It's not your fault, he replied. Thank you for being kind. Her cheeks flushed and she gave a quick nod before retreating to the counter. Marcus slid a few bills under the edge of his coffee mug, more than enough to cover the check, and made his way out the door. As he walked to his car, memories of his past began to surface, unbidden. It wasn't the first time he'd felt this kind of scrutiny, this quiet hostility. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, Marcus had learned early that survival meant understanding how to navigate two different worlds, the one where he was dismissed as a statistic and the one where he was expected to rise above it. His mother, a fierce woman with a voice that could cut through any crowd, had been his anchor. She worked long hours as a nurse, often coming home exhausted, but still finding the strength to remind Marcus of his worth. Baby, she would say, her hands cupping his face. The world's gonna try to tell you who you are, but don't you ever let them define you. You hear me? You've got greatness in you, show them. Her words had carried him through his darkest moments, when teachers overlooked him, when he was stopped and questioned by police for walking home late at night, when he doubted himself, during the grueling training to become a SEAL. She'd passed away 2 years ago, but her voice still lived within him, a quiet but unyielding source of strength. Later that night, Marcus pulled into the driveway of the small rental house he was staying in on the outskirts of town. It was a modest place with peeling white paint and a creaky front porch, but it was quiet and removed from the noise of his usual life. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished. He had taken leave from active duty after his last mission, sat in the corner of the living room, to heal, half unpacked, not just physically, while a single photo frame rested on the mantel. It was a picture of Marcus in his dress whites, standing proudly next to his mother. Her smile radiated joy, her arm wrapped tightly around him as though she'd known exactly how far he'd come. Marcus sat down on the worn couch and rubbed his hands over his face. The encounter at the diner lingered in his mind, not because it was unique, but because it was so painfully familiar. He thought about Hansen, about the simmering hatred in his eyes, and a flicker of unease crept into his chest. Men like Hansen didn't just let things go. The next morning, Marcus decided to clear his head with a run. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets. He moved through the town's quiet outskirts, his breathing steady, his mind focused on the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. As he rounded a corner near a small park, he noticed a group of kids playing basketball on a cracked asphalt court. Their laughter echoed in the still morning air, and for a moment Marcus slowed his pace to watch. One of the boys, a lanky teenager with an oversized hoodie, missed a shot and cursed under his breath. Marcus smiled faintly, remembering how many hours he'd spent on courts just like this one. "Hey," Marcus called out, jogging over. The boys stopped and turned, their expressions wary. "You mind if I shoot?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the ball. The boy holding it hesitated, glancing at his friends before finally tossing it over. Marcus caught it with ease, spinning it in his hands. He lined up a shot from the three-point line and sank it effortlessly. "Yo," one of the boys exclaimed, his face breaking into a grin. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Marcus chuckled, passing the ball back. "A lot of practice," he said. "You've got a good shot, though, just need to keep your wrist straight." The boy nodded, his earlier wariness melting away. As Marcus stayed to watch a few more plays, he felt a small sense of connection, brief but meaningful. He'd always believed in the power of moments like these, where kindness and guidance could plant seeds for something bigger. But the peace didn't last. That afternoon, as Marcus returned from running errands, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street from his rental. The windows were tinted, but he could feel the weight of eyes watching him. He walked inside, his senses on high alert. From his military training, he knew the difference between coincidence and intent. This wasn't random. Hours passed and the SUV didn't move. Marcus pretended not to notice, but his mind worked furiously, running through every possible scenario. Was this Hansen trying to intimidate him, or was it something else entirely? As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus made a decision. He stepped outside, his posture relaxed but deliberate, and walked toward the vehicle. His heart was steady, his breathing even, but his instincts were razor-sharp. He knocked on the driver's side window, the sound echoing in the stillness of the evening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the window rolled down just enough for him to see a pair of eyes staring back at him. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. The man inside said nothing, but his lips curled into a smirk before the window rolled back up. The SUV's engine roared to life and it sped off into the night, leaving Marcus standing in the driveway, his mind racing. Something wasn't right, and as the shadows of the night deepened, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The hum of the SUV's engine still lingered in Marcus's ears long after it disappeared down the darkened street. He stood motionless for a moment, staring at the empty spot where it had been parked, every nerve in his body on edge. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. Whoever was in that car wasn't done with him. As he walked back toward the house, Marcus's thoughts drifted to his training. In BUDS, the grueling selection process for Navy SEALs, he'd been taught that the smallest detail could mean the difference between survival and disaster. A flicker of movement, the angle of a shadow, the pattern of footsteps. Nothing was insignificant. That training had saved his life more times than he cared to count. But here, in the quiet of civilian life, it felt like a curse. The constant vigilance, the inability to let his guard down, it weighed on him in ways few could understand. Inside the house, Marcus locked the door and double-checked the windows. He wasn't paranoid, but he wasn't careless either. The thought of someone watching him, tracking his movements, sent a chill down his spine. His gaze fell on the framed photo of his mother on the mantel. Her smile was a stark contrast to the heaviness in his chest, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the ache of her absence. The next day, Marcus returned to the diner, partly to test whether Hansen would show up again and partly because he needed answers. The same waitress greeted him with a nervous smile, but the air inside felt different, tenser, as though the previous night's events had left an invisible scar on the space. As he settled into his booth, the door jingled, and a man in his late 40s entered. He was dressed in a plain suit, his posture stiff but deliberate. His sharp eyes scanned the room before settling on Marcus. Without hesitation, the man approached and slid into the booth across from him. "Marcus Reed?" The man asked, his voice low and firm. Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately. "Who's asking?" The man reached into his jacket and Marcus's muscles tensed. But instead of a weapon, the man produced a badge and held it out. "Agent Eric Malone, Department of Justice. Mind if we talk?" Marcus leaned back slightly, studying the badge. "You've got my attention." Malone's expression didn't change. He placed the badge on the table and clasped his hands in front of him. "You had an encounter with Officer Hansen last night." It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded anyway. "That's right." Malone exhaled, his gaze steady. "We've been watching Hansen for a while. There's reason to believe he's involved in some questionable activities. Harassment, abuse of power, targeting minorities. He's careful, though. Covers his tracks." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And what do you want from me?" "We need leverage," Malone said bluntly. "Someone with credibility who can stand up to him. Someone he can't intimidate or discredit." Marcus stared at the agent, his mind racing. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. He'd come to this town to find peace, to heal, not to get dragged into someone else's fight. But the image of Hansen's smug face and the weight of his mother's words echoed in his mind. "You've got greatness in you, show them." "What happens if I say no?" Marcus asked finally. Malone didn't flinch. "You keep living your life, and Hansen keeps doing what he's doing, until someone gets hurt or worse." The weight of the words hung between them, and Marcus felt the familiar pull of duty. He hated it, hated that he couldn't walk away, that the part of him trained to protect and fight for justice wouldn't let him ignore this. "Fine," Marcus said after a long pause. "I'll help, but don't expect me to do your job for you." Malone nodded, his expression betraying a flicker of relief. "That's all we need. For now, just keep your eyes open. Anything you notice, anything that feels off, let me know." He slid a business card across the table before standing. "And Marcus, be careful. Hansen's dangerous and he doesn't like being crossed." As Malone walked out, Marcus sat back, the cards still on the table. He didn't trust the agent entirely. His years in the military had taught him to be wary of people who only appeared when they needed something. But he couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut. Hansen wasn't just a bad cop. He was something worse. The conflict didn't take long to escalate. 2 days later, Marcus was at the local gym, working through a grueling weightlifting routine to clear his mind. The clatter of weights and hum of treadmills created a familiar rhythm, but the peace shattered when Hansen walked in. The officer spotted Marcus immediately, his eyes narrowing in that predatory way Marcus had come to recognize. Hansen didn't approach at first, instead lingering near the front desk, talking loudly to the attendant. Marcus caught snippets of the conversation, something about troublemakers and keeping the neighborhood safe. As Marcus finished his set, Hansen finally sauntered over, his expression a mixture of smugness and thinly veiled hostility. "Fancy seeing you here," Hansen said, leaning against a nearby machine. "Small town?" Marcus replied without looking up. Hansen chuckled. "You've got quite the reputation, don't you? Navy SEAL, war hero, all that. Must feel good walking around like you own the place." Marcus set the weights down deliberately, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want, Hansen?" The officer's smirk deepened. "Just making conversation. Thought maybe we got off on the wrong foot the other night." "You mean when you tried to intimidate me for drinking coffee?" Marcus shot back, his voice steady but sharp. Hansen's jaw tightened, the mask of friendliness slipping for a moment. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice low. "You don't want to make an enemy out of me?" Marcus stood, his full height forcing Hansen to take a half step back. "I don't need to make you my enemy," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You've already done that yourself." The two men stared at each other, the tension crackling between them like a live wire. Finally, Hansen sneered and turned away. "Be seeing you, Reed," he said over his shoulder as he walked out. That night, Marcus sat on the porch of his rental house, the darkness pressing in around him. The SUV hadn't returned, but the encounter with Hansen left him uneasy. He thought of his mother again, of the way she'd always encouraged him to fight for what was right, even when it was hard. He remembered a moment from his childhood, sitting at the kitchen table while she worked a double shift. He'd been frustrated after a teacher accused him of cheating on a test, unable to believe he could get an A on his own. "You've got two choices," his mother had said, her voice soft, but firm. "You can let them define you or you can prove them wrong. But whatever you do, you hold your head high. Don't ever let them see you break." Those words had carried him through Hell Week, through missions where the odds were stacked against him, and now they grounded him once more. Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't let Hansen or anyone else define him. If this town needed someone to stand up to the likes of Hansen, he would be that person. But as he sat there, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. Marcus turned sharply, his senses on high alert. A figure was standing at the edge of his driveway, just out of reach of the porch light. "Who's there?" Marcus called, his voice cutting through the silence. The figure stepped closer, and Marcus recognized Carter, Hansen's younger partner. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and he looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if he'd been followed. "I shouldn't be here," Carter said quietly, his voice shaking. Marcus stood, his body tense. "Then why are you?" Carter hesitated, his eyes darting around. "Hansen's not who you think he is," he said finally. He's involved in something big, something dangerous." Marcus stepped off the porch, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Before Carter could answer, the sound of tires screeching pierced the night. Both men turned as a car barreled down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "Get inside," Marcus shouted, grabbing Carter by the arm and pulling him toward the house. But before they could reach the door, the car skidded to a stop and two masked men stepped out, guns drawn. "Stay down," Marcus barked, shoving Carter behind the porch railing as bullets ripped through the night, shattering the quiet once more. And as the chaos unfolded, Marcus knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight, one that would test everything he'd ever learned and everything he believed in. The air was thick with tension as Marcus crouched behind the porch railing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The masked men moved with precision, their weapons raised as they advanced. Their steps were methodical, like they'd done this before, and that scared Marcus more than anything. Carter was trembling beside him, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder, silently willing him to stay quiet. He peeked through a crack in the railing, analyzing the men's positions. Years of SEAL training kicked in, his mind calculating distances and angles. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. Not now. The masked men split up, one circling toward the back of the house while the other approached the porch. Marcus's grip on the railing tightened. He had no weapon, no backup, and the man on the porch reached for the doorknob, but he had his wits. Marcus took the opportunity to grab a loose plank from the railing, holding it like a makeshift bat. As the intruder turned his back, Marcus struck, the force of the blow sending the man sprawling to the ground. "Move," Marcus barked at Carter, dragging him toward the side of the house. The other assailant heard the commotion and fired blindly into the dark, the bullets whizzing past them. Marcus and Carter sprinted toward the tree line, the sound of footsteps. "Close behind. Keep running," Marcus yelled, his voice steady despite the chaos. They ducked into the thick cover of the woods, the darkness swallowing them. Marcus knew the terrain was his best chance. He'd trained in environments far worse than this: jungle, desert, Arctic. He could use the shadows and trees to his advantage, but Carter was a liability. They stopped behind a large oak, both men panting. Marcus scanned the area, listening for movement. The masked men weren't far, their flashlight beams cutting through the night like searchlights. "What the hell is going on?" Carter whispered, his voice shaking. "You tell me," Marcus replied, his tone sharp. "You said Hansen's involved in something dangerous. What did you mean?" Carter hesitated, his eyes darting to the approaching lights. "He's working with people, powerful people. Smuggling, drugs, weapons. I don't even know everything, but they protect him. That's why no one can touch him." Marcus clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Hansen abusing his badge. It was bigger, darker. And now Marcus was in the crosshairs. "Why come to me?" Marcus demanded. "Because you're the only one who can stop him," Carter said, desperation in his voice. "Everyone else is either scared or bought off, but you're not like them." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of a branch snapping nearby silenced them both. Marcus gestured for Carter to stay low as he peered around the tree. One of the masked men was only a few feet away, his flashlight sweeping the ground. Marcus grabbed a rock and threw it in the opposite direction, the noise drawing the man's attention. As the intruder turned, Marcus lunged, tackling him to the ground. The struggle was brief but intense, and Marcus emerged victorious, the man unconscious at his feet. "Let's go," Marcus said, grabbing the man's flashlight. They moved deeper into the woods, the second masked man's shouts fading as they put more distance between themselves and the house. Marcus's mind was spinning. If Carter was telling the truth, Hansen wasn't just a rogue cop, he was part of a criminal enterprise, and Marcus had stumbled into the middle of it. Back at the house, Marcus barricaded the doors and windows, his body tense as he prepared for another attack. Carter sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he nursed a cup of water. "You've got to tell someone," Carter said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "And who am I supposed to tell?" Marcus shot back. "The DOJ is already watching Hansen, but they haven't done anything. If I go to the local cops, it's just as likely they're in on it." Carter looked at him, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I didn't know who else to trust," Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. He didn't want to be involved in this. He'd come here to start over, to find peace. But now, he was caught in a web of corruption and violence with no way out. "Get some rest," Marcus said finally. "Tomorrow we figure out our next move." The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. He grabbed a bat from the closet and peered through the curtains. To his surprise, it was Agent Malone. "Perfect timing," Marcus muttered, opening the door before Malone could knock. Malone's expression was grim. "I heard about last night. You okay?" "Define okay," Marcus replied, stepping aside to let the agent in. Carter appeared in the doorway, his face pale. Malone's eyes narrowed as he took in the younger man. "What's he doing here?" Malone asked. "He came to me," Marcus said. "Said Hansen's working with some kind of smuggling ring. Drugs, weapons, you name it." Malone's jaw tightened. "That lines up with what we've been hearing, but we don't have enough to take him down. Hansen's careful, he's got people protecting him." Marcus crossed his arms. "Then we make him slip up." Malone raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose we do that?" Marcus glanced at Carter, then back at Malone. "We make him think he's won. Draw him out. If he thinks he's got nothing to lose, he'll make a mistake." Malone hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. "That's a dangerous game, Reed." "I've played dangerous games before," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. That night, Marcus and Carter set the plan into motion. Carter sent a message to Hansen, claiming he had information that could incriminate him. The bait was simple but effective. Hansen agreed to meet in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, neutral ground, where he thought he'd have the upper hand. Marcus arrived early, scoping out the area and ensuring they weren't being watched. He positioned himself in the shadows, his eyes scanning the entrance as Carter waited inside. The tension was suffocating. Every creak of the building, every distant sound, felt amplified in the silence. Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. If this went wrong, they wouldn't get a second chance. A car pulled up outside, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Hansen stepped out, flanked by two men who looked every bit as dangerous as he did. "Carter," Hansen called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "You better have a damn good reason for dragging me out here." Carter stepped forward, his hands raised in a show of submission. "I just thought you'd want to know what I've been hearing," he said, his voice trembling but steady enough to sell the act. Hansen smirked, his eyes narrowing. "And what's that?" "That someone's coming after you," Carter said. "Someone who knows everything." For a moment, Hansen seemed amused, but then his expression darkened and he stepped closer, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You think this is a joke?" Hansen growled. "No," Carter said quickly. "I'm just trying to help. If you want, I can—" Before he could finish, Hansen grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against a nearby wall. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," he snarled. "You think you can betray me and walk away?" Marcus tensed, ready to intervene, but he waited for the right moment. "I didn't betray you," Carter pleaded. "I swear I'm on your side." Hansen's grip tightened and he leaned in close. "You're either with me or against me, Carter. And if you're against me—" He trailed off, the threat hanging in the air. Marcus stepped out of the shadows, his voice calm but commanding. "Let him go, Hansen." Hansen froze, his head snapping toward Marcus. For a moment, surprise flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by a smug grin. "Well, well," Hansen said, releasing Carter and turning to face Marcus. The hero himself. "Come to save the day?" Marcus's eyes didn't waver. "This ends here, Hansen." Hansen laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "You really think you can stop me? You don't know who you're dealing with." "Maybe not," Marcus said, "but I know your type. You hide behind your badge, but underneath it you're just a coward." Hansen's grin faltered, and his hand moved toward his gun. Marcus took a step closer, his voice steady. "Go ahead, make your move. But I promise you, I've faced worse than you." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Hansen's men shifted uneasily, their confidence waning as they watched Marcus stand his ground. Finally, Hansen smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got guts, Reed, I'll give you that." Before Marcus could respond, a door creaked open behind him and another figure stepped into the room. Marcus turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in the newcomer. It was someone he hadn't Seen before, but their presence sent a chill down his spine. They walked with authority, their gaze cold and calculating. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus demanded. The figure smiled faintly, their voice smooth and unsettling. "I'm the one who decides how this ends." The air grew colder, and Marcus knew in that moment that the fight was far from over. The air inside the warehouse was thick with tension, every sound amplified as Marcus locked eyes with the stranger. Their cold smile was unnerving, but there was something else, an air of authority, of quiet danger, that made even Hansen hesitate. The stranger strode forward, the echo of their polished boots reverberating through the cavernous space. They stopped between Marcus and Hansen, their calculating gaze sweeping over the room like a predator sizing up prey. "Looks like I arrived, just in time," the stranger said, their voice smooth but commanding. Hansen stepped back, his usual arrogance faltering. "What are you doing here? This wasn't part of the plan." Marcus's gut twisted. This wasn't just someone working with Hansen. This was someone above him, someone pulling the strings. "Plans change," the stranger replied coolly. They turned to Marcus, their expression unreadable. "You must be Marcus Reed. Quite the reputation you've built for yourself. Decorated, Navy SEAL, local hero, the man who just won't let sleeping dogs lie." Marcus held their gaze, refusing to back down. "And who are you?" The stranger's faint smile returned. "You can call me Sinclair. That's all you need to know for now." "I don't care who you are," Marcus said, his voice steady. "This ends tonight." Sinclair tilted their head, studying him like a puzzle. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery without leverage? That's just foolish." They gestured subtly, and Hansen's men stepped closer, their weapons raised. Marcus tensed, his mind racing for a way out. "What do you want?" Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. Sinclair chuckled softly. "What I want is order, control, something you've been disrupting with your little crusade." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Control through fear and corruption? That's not order, it's chaos." Sinclair's smile faded, their eyes hardening. "You don't understand the bigger picture, Reed. Sometimes, sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Hansen understands that. Do you?" Marcus's fists clenched, but before he could respond, a voice cut through the silence. "You're wrong." Everyone turned to see Carter stepping forward, his hands trembling but his eyes filled with determination. "Carter, what are you doing?" Marcus hissed. Carter ignored him, focusing on Sinclair. "People like you think you can do whatever you want, hurt whoever you want, and get away with it. But you're not untouchable." Sinclair raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And what do you think you're going to do about it, Mr. Carter? Talk me to death?" Carter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, holding it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, his voice steadying, "is a recording of every conversation I've had with Hansen. Every threat, every deal, every dirty secret. And I made sure it got backed up to a secure server." The room went silent, the weight of Carter's words hanging in the air. Hansen's face turned pale, and even Sinclair's confident demeanor wavered. "You're bluffing," Sinclair said, though their tone was less certain. Carter shook his head. "Try me. You take one more step and this goes public. Every news outlet, every agency, it'll all come crashing down." Marcus felt a surge of pride, but he kept his focus on the threat at hand. Sinclair's men were still armed, and the situation could turn deadly in an instant. Sinclair took a step toward Carter, their expression icy. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "No," Marcus said, stepping between them. "You don't." With lightning speed, Marcus grabbed a nearby steel pipe and swung it at the closest gunman, disarming him before he could react. Chaos erupted as the room devolved into a blur of movement and sound. Marcus fought with precision, his training taking over as he neutralized the threats one by one. Hansen tried to run, but Marcus intercepted him, slamming him against a stack of crates. "It's over, Hansen," Marcus growled, his grip like iron. "You think this will stop me?" Hansen sneered, blood trickling from his lip. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Maybe not," Marcus replied. But I know one thing. You're done. Behind them, Carter managed to evade Sinclair's grasp, his smaller frame, allowing him to slip through the chaos. He ducked behind a pile of crates, clutching the recording device like a lifeline. Sinclair, now alone, watched the scene with growing frustration. Their plan was unraveling, and for the first time they looked uncertain. Marcus turned to Sinclair, his voice sharp. You've lost. Walk away now, and maybe you'll still have a chance to fix this. Sinclair's eyes narrowed, their mind clearly racing. But before they could respond, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Backup's here, Marcus said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Sinclair's men scattered, their loyalty evaporating, in the face of imminent arrest. Hansen struggled in Marcus's grip, but it was no use. Sinclair took a step back, their expression cold and calculating. This isn't over, Reed, they said before slipping out a side door and disappearing into the night. The warehouse was soon flooded with law enforcement, the flashing lights illuminating the scene. Hansen was taken into custody, his protests falling on deaf ears. Marcus watched as the corrupt officer was led away, a sense of relief washing over him. You did it, Carter said, his voice filled with awe. No, Marcus replied, his gaze steady. We did it. Agent Malone approached, his expression a mix of gratitude and respect. Hell of a job, Reed. You just blew this whole operation wide open. Marcus nodded, though he knew the fight wasn't over. Sinclair was still out there, and the corruption they represented ran deep. As the chaos subsided, Marcus looked around the warehouse, his mind replaying the events of the night. He felt a sense of closure, but also a lingering unease. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that allowed people like Hansen and Sinclair to thrive. And Marcus knew he couldn't walk away. Not yet. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his face, carrying with it a sense of both victory and purpose. This was just the beginning. As dawn broke over the city, Marcus stood on the steps of the precinct, the early sunlight glinting off the shield he held tightly in his hand. The night's chaos had finally subsided, but the echoes of its events still lingered in his mind. Hansen was behind bars, Sinclair's operation was exposed, and the corrupt web they'd spun was beginning to unravel. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like justice had prevailed. But the victory wasn't without its cost. A city wakes to the truth. By midday, the news was everywhere. Headlines blared across television screens and smartphones. Corrupt police network exposed by Navy SEAL veteran, and heroic stand brings justice to long-ignored corruption. Carter's recordings, released to the press with the help of Agent Malone, painted a damning picture of Hansen's misconduct and the wider network of corruption that Sinclair had fostered. People were furious but galvanized. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, demanding accountability and sweeping reforms. For years, many in the community had whispered about the systemic rot within law enforcement, but now the proof was undeniable. Inside the precinct, Marcus faced a room full of officers. Some glared at him with resentment, while others gave him cautious nods of respect. He knew the fallout would be messy. Not everyone would support the change, but he had no intention of backing down now. Agent Malone approached him, a folder in hand. This is just the start, Marcus. With the evidence Carter handed over, we've got enough to launch a full-scale investigation into Sinclair's operation. But it's going to take time. Marcus nodded. What about Sinclair? Any leads? Malone frowned. They're slippery, I'll give them that. But they'll slip up. People like Sinclair always do. Marcus stared out the window at the growing crowd of protesters. When they do, I'll be ready. The weight of reflection. Later that evening, Marcus found himself back at his small apartment. The adrenaline of the past 24 hours had worn off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. He sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. The scars on his hands and the ache in his muscles were a reminder of the battles he'd fought. both overseas and here at home. But tonight, a different memory came to mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. It was a picture of his father, a stern but kind man who had spent his life fighting for fairness in a system that wasn't built for it. "You always said to stand tall no matter what," Marcus murmured to the photo. "I just wish you were here to see it." His father's words echoed in his mind, a mantra he'd carried through the toughest moments. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every time you do. The events of the past few days had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But as he sat there, Marcus realized that his father's wisdom had carried him through once again. Consequences and accountability. The following week brought swift action. Hansen's arrest sent shockwaves through the department, leading to the suspension and investigation of several other officers implicated in Carter's recordings. Internal. Affairs moved quickly, determined to clean house before the public uproar grew any louder. As for Hansen, he faced a barrage of charges, from abuse of power to conspiracy and bribery. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a desperation to cut a deal. But Marcus made sure Malone and the prosecutors knew the truth. Hansen wasn't just a pawn. He was a willing participant who had thrived on the suffering of others. Sinclair, however, remained elusive. Their disappearance only added to their mystique, fueling speculation and fear. But Marcus knew their time would come. The kind of power Sinclair wielded always came at a price, and Marcus was determined to make sure they paid it. Rebuilding relationships. Amid the chaos, Marcus found unexpected support in Carter. The young man, once timid and unsure, had found his voice during the ordeal. Together, they began organizing community meetings, creating a space for residents to air their grievances and demand change. "You've come a long way, Carter," Marcus said one evening after a particularly passionate meeting. Carter smiled, though his eyes were still shadowed by the weight of everything he'd been through. "I had a good example." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "This is just the beginning. Keep pushing. People like you can make a real difference." Carter nodded, a flicker of hope lighting his expression. A community transformed. The weeks turned into months, and while the scars of the past couldn't be erased, the city began to heal. New policies were introduced to ensure greater accountability within the police force, and a civilian oversight committee was established to give the community a direct voice in law enforcement matters. Marcus became a reluctant figurehead for the movement, though he often tried to deflect the attention onto others. "This isn't about me," he'd say at every press conference. "It's about all of us. Together we can build something better." Despite his humility, Marcus's presence was a powerful symbol. His unwavering commitment and quiet strength inspired others to stand up and demand more from their leaders. A final message. One crisp autumn evening, Marcus stood on a small stage in the heart of the city, addressing a crowd that had gathered for a candlelight vigil. The glow of the candles reflected in his eyes as he looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, others strangers, but all united in their desire for change. "I've seen a lot in my life," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen the worst of humanity, but I've also seen the best. And what I've learned is that real strength comes from standing together, even when it's hard, even when it hurts." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We still have a long way to go, but tonight I see hope. I see a community that refuses to be divided, that refuses to give up. And as long as we hold on to that hope, nothing can stop us." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers carrying into the night. As Marcus stepped off the stage, Carter was there to meet him, a proud smile on his face. "You think your dad would be proud?" Carter asked. Marcus looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he would." A new chapter. As the city continued its journey toward justice and healing, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. He'd spent his life fighting battles, first as a Navy SEAL, then as a man trying to right the wrongs in his own backyard. But now, for the first time, he felt like the fight was no longer his alone. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop fighting for what was right. And as he walked away from the vigil, the sound of the crowd's cheers fading into the night, Marcus felt a quiet certainty settle over him. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt like they might actually win.